In the 2010 remake of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Robert Englund declined to reprise his role as Freddy Krueger, and the actor had a valid reason for doing so. Robert Englund playing Freddy Krueger in A Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 might have been beneficial, but having the original lead return would not have been enough to save the remake. In the latter part of the 2000s, a flood of slasher remakes of beloved horror films from the 1980s appeared. It was inevitable that Wes Craven's renowned fantasy slasher movie A Nightmare on Elm Street would be remade, since everything from Halloween to Friday the 13th was rebooted. Indeed, Samuel Bayer's 2010 adaptation of the 1984 film A Nightmare on Elm Street, which was universally panned by both fans of the series and reviewers, was released. While many critics felt that the 2010 version of A Nightmare on Elm Street was an almost excessively faithful reproduction, Robert Englund, who played Freddy Krueger in the original, was not recast in his most well-known role. Englund declined the role for a good reason, and his explanation for doing so shows that the project couldn't have been saved by even Englund's beloved Freddy. Englund noted that the majority of performers, including himself, prefer sequels to remakes. Even the worst Nightmare on Elm Street sequels up until 2010 starred Englund as Freddy, but the actor made note that Mel Gibson, despite possibly appearing in a sequel, would never return to the role of Martin Riggs in a Lethal Weapon remake. Englund stated that he might portray Freddy in Nightmare on Elm Street 9, but he was unable to perform the part in a new adaptation of the original Nightmare on Elm Street film. It was a valid argument that shows the remake was always doomed, since even if Englund had played the part again, he would have been replicating dialogue, action, and beats from decades ago. Robert Englund, the franchise's star and a horror icon, was right to steer clear of the reboot, even though losing the original Freddy made the Nightmare on Elm Street remake even more difficult to defend. The 2010 remake of Nightmare on Elm Street was panned by critics primarily for failing to improve upon the 1984 original, since it was far more repetitious than the majority of its slasher remake peers. Even though Rob Zombie's Halloween remake, for instance, caused a great deal of controversy, the 2007 version did differ significantly from the 1978 film. Similar to how the 2009 Friday the 13th remake was more of an amalgamation of everything that made the original films successful than a straightforward replica of the 1980 original, the film was made stronger as a result. In comparison, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 changed very little about its plot. Thus, Englund was right to point out that if he had starred in the disastrous film, he would have been repeating himself. There was no need for the 2010 remake because it didn't offer a fresh interpretation of the story and characters from the 1984 film A Nightmare on Elm Street. Therefore, even if Robert Englund had returned to the role of Freddy Krueger, his mere presence wouldn't have been enough to save the film.